He couldn't see her face. He didn't know her name at first, but every single day she showed up. And slowly, she became the only reason he wanted to keep living. What happened when he finally saw her will break your heart in ways you never expected. Subscribe to Soul of Kindness for more heart-touching stories. The hospital room on the 4th floor of St. Michael's Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio was quiet in the way that only sick rooms can be. A heavy, suffocating silence that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. The blinds were always half closed. The television was almost never on. The man in bed 7 preferred it that way. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 43 years old, and 3 months ago, he had been a structural engineer, a man who spent his days looking at blueprints, calculating load-bearing walls, designing buildings that would stand for centuries. A man who trusted his eyes above everything else. Then came the accident, a construction site collapse, a steel beam, and in a single brutal second, darkness. The doctors called it traumatic bilateral optic nerve damage. What that meant in simple terms was this: Daniel Mercer would never see again. His wife Claire had come to the hospital the first week. She sat beside him, held his hand, told him everything would be okay. But somewhere between the diagnosis and the reality of what their life would now look like, she stopped coming every day, then every other day, then once a week. Then she called instead of visited. And then, one quiet Tuesday morning, she sent her sister with divorce papers and a short note that said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." Daniel didn't cry when he heard those words. He had already cried everything out. He simply nodded and asked the nurse to guide his hand to the signature line. That nurse was named Rachel. Rachel Connors was 29 years old, and she had been working the morning shift on the 4th floor for 4 years. She was not the kind of nurse who talked too much or filled silence with cheerful noise to make herself feel better. She understood that sometimes suffering didn't need words, it needed presence. From the very first morning, she walked into room 7 and introduced herself. She noticed something different about Daniel, not his blindness, not his silence. It was the way he held himself, like a man who was physically present but had made a quiet decision, somewhere deep inside, to stop existing. She recognized that feeling. She had worn it herself once. She went about her work without forcing conversation. She checked his vitals, adjusted his IV, made sure his water was within reach. But she always placed his water glass on the right side, not the left like the other nurses, because she had noticed, quietly and without a word, that his right hand moved more naturally. He noticed too. "You're the one who always puts the glass on the right," he said one morning, about 2 weeks after she started caring for him. "You remember," she said simply. "I don't see anymore," he said. "But I remember everything." That was how it started. Their conversations began small: weather, food, weather, the coffee from the hospital. Cafeteria was as bad as it smelled. Daniel had a dry, unexpected sense of humor that caught Rachel off guard the first time he used it, and she laughed. A real laugh, not the practiced, polite laugh of a caregiver. He heard the difference immediately. "That's the first real laugh I've heard in this room," he said. "Probably because nothing real gets said in hospital rooms," she replied before she could stop herself. He smiled. It was the first time the nurses on the 4th floor had seen Daniel Mercer smile. Day by day, something shifted. Rachel started arriving at room 7 a few minutes earlier than necessary. She brought him audiobooks from the small cart in the family lounge. First a thriller, because it seemed safe. Then a novel about a man who rebuilds his life after catastrophic loss, because something told her he needed it. She never explained why she chose the books she chose. He never asked. He listened to that second book twice. On a Friday afternoon near the end of his 2nd month, Daniel said, "Tell me something true about yourself." Not nurse true, actually true. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I almost quit nursing 3 years ago. I was in a bad place. I came back because I didn't know what else to do with the part of me that still wanted to help people." He absorbed that in silence. Then he said, "I'm glad you came back." She didn't know why those 4 words hit her so hard. She had to look out the window for a moment before she could respond. What Rachel had not told Daniel, what she had not told anyone at St. Michael's, was the reason she had almost quit 3 years ago. She had been engaged. His name was Marcus, and he was charming in the effortless way of people who never have to try. They had been together for 2 years, and Rachel had believed with her whole heart that she had found her person. Then she discovered on a random Wednesday that Marcus had another woman, had had her for 8 months, that the other woman was pregnant. Rachel had not just lost a relationship, she had lost her version of the future. She had lost the house they were going to buy, the children they had named in whispered conversations, the entire life she had been quietly, carefully building. She fell apart in a way that frightened her. She called in sick for 2 weeks. She stopped eating properly. She stared at walls. And then one morning, she put on her scrubs, drove to the hospital, walked into a patient's room, and felt, for the first time in weeks, like herself again. She had buried the grief so completely that she thought it was gone. It wasn't gone. She realized that slowly, sitting in room 7, talking to a man who couldn't see her face, who had no idea what she looked like, who had no reason to be kind to her except that kindness was simply what he had left. She was healing in that room. She hadn't meant to, but she was, and she was terrified of it. At the beginning of Daniel's 3rd month, his doctor, Dr. Anand Sharma, requested a specialized consultation with a neuro-ophthalmologist from Cleveland. The results of that consultation sent a quiet shock through the nursing staff before Daniel himself was told the optic nerve damage, while severe, was not entirely irreversible. There was a procedure, experimental but with a 60% success rate in cases similar to Daniel's. It would require surgery, a recovery period, and a significant amount of uncertainty. But 60% was not nothing. 60% was a door where there had been no door at all. Dr. Sharma sat with Daniel and explained everything carefully. Daniel listened without interrupting. When the doctor finished, there was a long silence. "What happens if it doesn't work?" Daniel asked. "Then your condition remains as it is." Another silence. "I'll think about it," Daniel said. Dr. Sharma nodded and left. An hour later, Rachel came in for the afternoon check. She could feel the shift in the room before Daniel spoke. "Did you know," he asked, "about the procedure?" "I found out this morning." "What do you think I should do?" She paused. It wasn't her place. She knew that, but he wasn't asking her as his nurse. "I think," she said slowly, "that you have spent 3 months learning how to live without seeing, and somewhere in that time you started to actually live again. Whatever you decide, that's not going away." He was quiet for a long time after that. "If I could see again," he said finally, "the first thing I'd want to see is the face of the person who made me want to keep going." Rachel said nothing, but her hand, without planning, rested gently on his for just a moment before she stepped back. She told herself it meant nothing. She repeated that to herself all the way home that night. Daniel agreed to the procedure. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and the floor had a different energy that week, the kind of held breath tension that comes when something large and irreversible is approaching. The nurses smiled at Daniel with extra warmth. The orderlies lingered an extra moment when they brought his meals. Rachel worked the morning of the surgery. She was the one who walked beside his gurney as they wheeled him toward the operating wing. She described everything she could see, the color of the walls, the morning light coming through the windows at the end of the hallway, the way the floor tiles changed from blue to white as they crossed into the surgical corridor. "Why are you doing that?" he asked. "In case it helps," she said. "In case it works and you want to remember what it felt like to hear about it first." He reached up and found her hand briefly. "Thank you, Rachel." She stood in the hallway until the surgical doors closed. The operation lasted 6 hours. Rachel was not on shift during the recovery room phase. She went home, sat at her kitchen table, and found herself unable to do anything at all. She made tea she didn't drink. She tried to read and couldn't. She sat with the strange, frightening understanding that something had happened to her that she hadn't planned and couldn't undo. She was in love with a man she had never let herself look at too long. A man whose voice she knew better than any face. A man who was, right now, either waking up to a world he could see, or waking up to the same darkness and finding the strength to bear it. She didn't sleep that night. 3 days after the surgery, the bandages were ready to come off. Dr. Sharma had asked that only essential medical staff be present for the unbandaging and initial assessment. Rachel was not technically required to be there, but she came in early, and she stood near the back of the room, close to the wall, where she would be visible if his vision returned, but not in the way. She had done her hair. She didn't examine why too closely. Dr. Sharma carefully, slowly removed the bandaging layers. Daniel sat upright in the bed, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the blanket across his lap. The room was very quiet. The last layer came away. Daniel blinked. Once, twice. The doctor held up his hand. How many fingers? A pause that lasted a century. 3, Daniel said. His voice came out broken. A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, not quite a cheer. Dr. Sharma was saying something clinical and important about next steps and continued monitoring. But no one was fully listening because Daniel Mercer was crying. Not quietly. The way a person cries when they have been in the dark for so long that light itself is a kind of grief. He looked around the room slowly, at the ceiling, at the window, at his own hands held up before him, and then his gaze moved to the back of the room. And he saw Rachel. She wasn't prepared for the way he looked at her. It wasn't the grateful look of a patient seeing a caregiver. It was the look of a man seeing for the first time the face of the voice that had pulled him back from the edge. He broke down completely. "You're her," he said, barely audible. "You're actually her." Rachel pressed her hand over her mouth. She was not supposed to cry in front of patients. She cried anyway. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's vision continued to improve with therapy and monitoring. He was discharged from St. Michael's on a bright October morning, and the fourth-floor staff lined the hallway in the quiet, unofficial way that hospital workers do when someone they rooted for gets to go home. Rachel was not in the hallway. She had told herself that appropriate, professional distance was the right choice now that he was leaving. She was in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee, giving herself a firm, internal lecture about boundaries and reality and the fact that what happened in hospitals wasn't the same as what happened in life. She heard footsteps stop outside the break room door. A knock. She opened it, and Daniel was standing there in regular clothes for the first time. Jeans, a grey jacket, looking like the person he must have been before the darkness took him. He was looking at her face with an expression she couldn't fully name. "I needed to say goodbye properly," he said. "You don't have to." "I spent 3 months listening to you," he said. "The way you moved. The way you laughed when you forgot you were supposed to be professional. The way you got quiet when something I said hit somewhere real." He paused. "I knew you before I could see you, and now that I can see you, I don't want to say goodbye." Rachel looked at this man who had arrived in her care as a broken, vanishing person, and had somehow, without trying, without asking, brought something back in her that she had packed away and buried. "I'm not good at this," she said honestly. "I got hurt badly once, and I'm not sure I'm all the way fixed." "I'm not all the way fixed either," he said. "But I know what it sounds like when someone still wants to be here. And every time you walked into that room, you sounded like someone who was choosing to stay." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped into the hallway. On a Sunday in October, Daniel Mercer stood at the front of a small, sunlit chapel outside Columbus. He was looking, really looking, with eyes that had come back to him like a second chance, at a woman walking toward him down the aisle. Rachel was wearing a simple ivory dress. She was not looking at the flowers or the guests or the soft afternoon light pouring through the stained glass. She was looking at him. Later at the reception, someone asked Daniel what it felt like, seeing the woman you fell in love with in total darkness, and then getting to see her for real. He thought about it for a moment. "When I was blind," he said quietly, "I learned to see her in every other way first. The way she moved, the way she cared, the way she showed up, not because she had to, but because something in her still needed to believe that people were worth showing up for. He paused. When my sight came back, her face was the first thing I really looked at, and she was exactly who I already knew she was. He looked across the room to where Rachel was laughing at something her bridesmaid said, her eyes catching his for a brief, warm second. "Some people spend their whole lives looking," he said, "and never really see anything." I lost my sight, and somehow that's when I saw the most clearly. The greatest acts of love are often invisible to the eye. They live in the small, quiet choices, the water glass placed on the right side, the book chosen with care, the presence that asks for nothing and gives everything. Sometimes we have to lose our sight to finally learn how to see.